My name is Hannah Brooks, and just 2 days before my wedding, my parents gave me a choice no daughter should ever have to make. Either my grandfather lost his seat at the head table, or they would walk away from the rehearsal, the wedding, and my life. My father didn't yell. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his expensive suit and said, almost casually, "He's just a retired school janitor, Hannah. Think about how this looks, how it looked." That was always more important to them than how it felt. The man they wanted hidden away wasn't just my grandfather. He was the man who packed my lunches. He helped with every school project. He stayed awake through every fever. He was the one who showed up every single time my parents couldn't. To them, he was an embarrassment. To me, he was home. What happened next is something none of us could have predicted. Because before that wedding reception ended, the CEO of my father's company would cross an entire ballroom, stop in front of my grandfather, and say 4 words that shattered 30 years of carefully built lies. Even I had no idea who my grandfather really was. If you've ever had someone judge another person by their job instead of their character, you'll understand exactly why this story still brings tears to my eyes. I grew up believing every family worked the way mine did. I was 7 years old when my parents moved to Columbus after my father accepted a promotion with Meridian Freight Systems. To him, it wasn't just another job. It was the beginning of the life he'd always dreamed about. He talked about the company's headquarters the way some people talk about famous landmarks. My mother was just as ambitious. She had started building her real estate career, and together they convinced themselves the move was only temporary. They sat me down one evening and promised I'd stay with Grandpa Walter for just 1 year. A 1 year turned into another, then another. Before I realized it, my entire childhood had passed in Grandpa's little house outside Dayton. Looking back now, I don't think my parents ever planned for it to happen that way. Life simply became easier without me living under their roof. Grandpa never complained. Not once. His house was small, but it always felt warm. Every room smelled faintly of fresh coffee, furniture polish, and the cinnamon rolls he made every Saturday morning. Dinner was always served at 6 o'clock sharp. Didn't matter if it snowed. Didn't matter if the power went out. Didn't matter if either of us had a bad day. At 6 we sat together. That was simply how life worked. Grandpa worked as the custodian at Garfield Elementary. Ironically, it was also the school I attended. Most afternoons I'd finish my homework in the library while he finished locking classrooms, checking doors, and making sure every hallway looked better than it had that morning. He never called himself just a janitor. In fact, I don't think I ever heard him talk about his job that way. To Grandpa, taking care of a building meant taking care of the people inside it. Every evening, before turning off the lights, he'd smile and repeat the same sentence. Leave every room better than you found it. At the time, I thought he was talking about classrooms. Years later, I realized he was talking about life. Whenever I made mistakes, and believe me, I made plenty, he never scolded me first. If I spilled paint during art class, we cleaned it together. When I accidentally broke a neighbor's window trying to learn baseball, he helped me earn every dollar to replace it. Then he'd smile. Leave every room better than you found it, kiddo. Eventually those words became part of who I was. I stopped noticing how often he said them. Kind of like how you stop noticing your own heartbeat until something makes it skip. My parents visited every couple of months. To be fair, they rarely missed birthdays or holidays. But their visits never felt relaxing. They felt scheduled. My father reviewed my report cards the same way he reviewed business reports. Every A was expected. Every B required an explanation. My mother walked through Grandpa's house quietly, noticing everything: the neatly trimmed lawn, the spotless windows, the freshly painted porch, the perfectly organized garage. She looked around the way realtors inspect houses before listing them. At 9 years old, I couldn't understand the expression on her face. Today I know exactly what it was: judgment. Not because Grandpa's house was dirty, because it was small. My father believed success could be measured. Titles, income, neighborhood, the kind of car parked in your driveway. Those things mattered to him more than almost anything else. Love in our family often felt tied to achievement. You earned approval. You earned praise. Sometimes it felt like you earned the right to belong. Years later, when I called to tell him I'd accepted a job with the United States Postal Service, I expected him to be proud. I loved the work. It came with great benefits, a pension, job security, and something even more valuable. People knew me. Children waved when they saw my mail truck. Neighbors left Christmas cookies in my mailbox every December. I mattered in my community. After I told him, my father stayed silent for several seconds. Then he asked one question. Are you comfortable telling people that's what you do? He didn't yell. He never needed to. Disappointment sounded much quieter in our family. My mother mailed me a tailored blazer a week later. She said it would be useful. When I eventually interviewed for something better, I wore it once. To a funeral. There was one thing about my parents that puzzled me more than anything else. They never argued with Grandpa. They barely acknowledged him. Company dinners, holiday parties, promotion celebrations, retirement banquets, no matter the occasion. Grandpa's name somehow never appeared on the guest list. At first I assumed it was an oversight. Then I realized it was intentional. The year my father became vice president, he rented half of an upscale steakhouse for a celebration. Nearly 200 people attended, regional directors, executives, friends, business associates. Grandpa wasn't invited. Not because there wasn't room, because my father didn't want anyone asking who he was. One Thanksgiving, when I was 25, I finally asked why. My father didn't hesitate. Some worlds don't belong together. That was the entire conversation. At the time, I let it go. I wish I hadn't, because 4 years later, I'd discover exactly what he meant. And by then, my wedding invitations had already been mailed. The turning point came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Ethan had planned everything so carefully that I almost missed what was happening. He suggested we take Grandpa out for lunch at our favorite little diner just outside Dayton. The kind of place where the waitress already knew our names and started pouring coffee before we even sat down. Grandpa ordered his usual grilled cheese with tomato soup. I ordered a turkey sandwich. Ethan barely touched his food. I figured he was just nervous about something at work. Instead, halfway through lunch, he reached into his jacket pocket. He slid out a small velvet box. For a second, the whole restaurant seemed to disappear. Hannah, he said, his voice shaking just enough to make me smile. Every good thing in my life started the day I met you. I don't want another day to pass without asking, will you marry me? Before I could even answer, tears filled my eyes. I looked across the table. Grandpa was already crying. Not quietly. Not trying to hide it. Just openly wiping his eyes with a paper napkin while smiling from ear to ear. When I finally managed to say yes, he wrapped both of us in the biggest hug I'd ever felt. I've been waiting for this day, he whispered. I knew he'd ask eventually. Later that evening, after Ethan left, Grandpa surprised me again. He walked into his bedroom and returned carrying an old wooden box I'd never seen before. The wood was scratched from decades of use, and the brass hinges had turned dull with age. He placed it gently on the kitchen table. I've been saving this for a long time. Inside were neatly stacked savings bonds, certificates of deposit, and carefully organized envelopes. I wanted to help with your wedding. I stared at him in disbelief. Grandpa, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, he answered softly. I want to. He explained that every extra shift, every overtime weekend, every unused vacation day over the last 20 years had gone into that box. Not for himself. For me. The total came to just over $30,000. I couldn't even speak. $30,000 wasn't just money. It was birthdays where he bought himself nothing. Vacations he never took. New clothes he never purchased. Dreams he'd quietly postponed so mine could come true. I pushed the box back toward him. I can't accept this. He smiled the same gentle smile I'd known since childhood. You already have. What do you mean? I accepted the gift the day you became my granddaughter. That broke me. I hugged him so tightly neither of us could breathe for a moment. Some people leave their children fortunes. Others leave them wisdom. Grandpa somehow managed to give me both. When my parents heard the engagement news, they reacted exactly as I expected. My mother immediately asked where the ceremony would be. My father wanted to know how many guests Ethan's family could invite. Neither one asked how Ethan proposed. Neither asked if I was happy. Within a week, they insisted on taking over the wedding planning. "It needs to reflect the family," my mother kept saying. That phrase sounded harmless at first. Soon it became obvious what she really meant. She booked one of the most prestigious country clubs in central Ohio, crystal chandeliers, imported flowers, a ballroom large enough for nearly 300 guests. Everything looked breathtaking. Everything also came with a breathtaking price tag. Fortunately, Grandpa's savings covered much of it, while Ethan and I paid the rest ourselves. Oddly enough, my parents never mentioned where the money had actually come from. They were perfectly comfortable taking credit for a wedding they weren't financing. As the guest list grew longer, I noticed something else. Almost every new name belonged to one of my father's business associates, regional directors, corporate executives, investors, board members, clients, people I'd never met, people Ethan had never met. Our wedding slowly began feeling less like a celebration of two families, and more like a networking event. One evening, while reviewing the seating chart, my father tapped the page with his pen. "These tables closest to the stage are reserved for senior leadership." He pointed toward another section. "We'll put your grandfather back here." I frowned. "Back where?" "Table 17. I studied the diagram. Table 17 sat all the way across the ballroom, practically hidden behind one of the decorative columns, nearly 50 feet away from the head table. At first I thought he was joking, then I realized he wasn't. "He belongs with family," I said. "He is family." My father leaned back in his chair. "Technically." I felt my stomach tighten. "What does that mean?" "It means appearances matter." I looked at him, waiting for the rest. He sighed. "Hannah, many of my colleagues have never met him. So, he spent his career cleaning schools. There it was. Not concern. Not logistics. Embarrassment. He worked honestly for 40 years. "That's not the point." "No," I answered quietly. "I think it is." The room fell silent. My mother finally stepped in. "We're only trying to protect the image we've worked so hard to build." Image. Again, always image. Never people, never love, never gratitude, only appearances. I folded the seating chart in half and slid it back across the table. "I'm not discussing this anymore." For a moment, I thought the conversation was over. I couldn't have been more wrong. Because 2 days before the wedding, my parents gave me an ultimatum that would change everything. And before the weekend was over, the truth about Grandpa Walter would leave an entire ballroom speechless. The rehearsal dinner should have been one of the happiest nights of my life. Instead, it became the night I finally understood how far my parents were willing to go to protect an image that existed only in their own minds. The private dining room buzzed with conversation as friends and family mingled over dinner. Ethan's parents laughed easily with everyone they met, making complete strangers feel like lifelong friends. Grandpa Walter fit right in, quietly listening more than he spoke, smiling whenever someone included him in the conversation. That's who he was. He never tried to become the center of attention. He simply made everyone around him feel seen. Watching him that evening reminded me why so many people loved him. Halfway through dinner, my father tapped his wine glass with a fork. "I'd like everyone's attention for just a moment." The room fell silent. He welcomed our guests, thanked everyone for traveling, and spoke about the importance of family traditions. Then he casually mentioned the seating arrangements for the wedding reception. Everything sounded normal, until he looked directly at me. "There have been a few necessary adjustments." A strange feeling settled in my stomach. He continued, "To accommodate several executives from Meridian Freight Systems, we've reassigned a few seats." I already knew where this was headed. He smiled as though he were announcing something completely reasonable. "Your grandfather will be seated at table 17. The room didn't react. No one understood what those words really meant, but I did. I slowly set my fork down. "Actually," I said calmly, "Grandpa will be sitting with us." My father's smile disappeared. "We've already discussed this." "No," I replied. "You told me your decision. You never asked for mine." Several conversations around the room stopped. People were beginning to notice. My mother leaned toward me and lowered her voice. "This isn't the place." "You're right," I answered. It shouldn't have become an issue at all. My father's expression hardened. Hannah, don't make a scene. I looked around the room. I didn't. You did. The silence became almost uncomfortable. Then my father said the words I would never forget. Hannah, think about the people attending tomorrow. I am. No. You're thinking emotionally. Yes, I replied. Because it's my wedding. He sighed heavily. You have CEOs, investors, and senior executives coming. I nodded. And? They expect a certain level of professionalism. I stared at him. What exactly does Grandpa have to do with professionalism? He hesitated. Then he finally said it. I don't want my colleagues asking why the father of the bride spent 40 years cleaning classrooms. The words seemed to echo around the room. No one spoke. Even the waitstaff stopped moving. Grandpa quietly looked down at his coffee cup. He didn't defend himself. He didn't argue. He simply accepted the insult, the same way he'd accepted so many others throughout his life. That hurt more than anything. I pushed my chair back. The sound echoed through the room. My grandfather spent 40 years making sure thousands of children walked into clean, safe classrooms every morning. I looked directly at my father. How many lives did your quarterly reports change? His face turned bright red. This conversation is over. No, Bo. It just started. Before anyone could speak again, Grandpa gently placed his hand on my arm. It's all right, kiddo. His voice was as calm as ever. I don't mind sitting wherever they need me. I turned toward him in disbelief. Grandpa. He smiled. I came to watch you marry the man you love. That's enough for me. This kindness only made the situation more painful. He was protecting the very people who had spent years pretending he didn't belong. That's what love looked like to Grandpa. It never kept score. After dinner, guests slowly drifted toward the parking lot. The warm summer air should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt heavy. My parents asked me to stay behind. As soon as everyone else was out of earshot, my father folded his arms. We need to settle this tonight. I already knew what was coming. If your grandfather sits at the head table, he paused, your mother and I won't attend the wedding. The words landed like a punch. For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. What? You heard me. My mother spoke next. Her voice unusually calm. We love you. But we cannot be part of something that damages everything we've worked for. I looked at both of them. You'd miss your only daughter's wedding. Because of where Grandpa sits. It isn't about the seat. My father answered immediately. It's about perception. I laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because I couldn't believe those words were coming from my own parents. You keep talking about perception. I'm talking about family. Neither of them answered. Finally, my father delivered his ultimatum. You have until tomorrow morning. Choose. Your grandfather. Or us. I stood there long after they drove away. The parking lot was almost empty. Only one car remained. Grandpa's old pickup truck. He was sitting behind the wheel, waiting for me. Just like he always had. When I climbed inside, he didn't ask what happened. He already knew. He simply reached over and squeezed my hand. Neither of us spoke during the drive home. Some silences say everything words never could. As we pulled into his driveway, he looked at me with the same gentle smile I'd seen my entire life. Whatever happens tomorrow, don't let bitterness become part of your marriage. Even after everything my parents had done, he was still teaching me how to choose kindness. What neither of us knew was that less than 24 hours later, someone would walk into that wedding reception, recognize Grandpa Walter immediately, and reveal a truth that would leave my father standing speechless in front of every executive he had spent decades trying to impress. The morning of my wedding began the way little girls imagine it will. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Bridesmaids hurried from room to room. Someone laughed in the hallway. Someone else searched frantically for missing earrings. Hairspray floated through the air, and soft music played in the background. To everyone else, it looked perfect. Inside, I felt anything but. I hadn't slept more than an hour. My father's ultimatum replayed in my mind over and over. Choose your grandfather, or choose us. No daughter should ever hear those words, yet here I was. Standing in a white wedding dress, wondering whether my own parents would be there to watch me walk down the aisle. A gentle knock interrupted my thoughts. It was Grandpa Walter. He stood outside the bridal suite wearing the charcoal, gray suit we'd picked out together a month earlier. It wasn't expensive, but it fit him perfectly. His silver hair was neatly combed, and the small white rose pinned to his lapel matched my bouquet. For just a second, I saw the man who had raised me, not the retired custodian, not the man my parents tried so hard to hide, simply, my grandfather. "You look beautiful, kiddo." His voice cracked as he spoke. "So do you," I teased. He chuckled. "I don't think anyone's ever said that to an old man before." We both laughed. It was exactly what I needed. He reached into his jacket pocket. I almost forgot. He handed me a tiny velvet pouch. Inside was a delicate silver necklace with a small heart-shaped pendant. "I bought it years ago." "You did? I wasn't sure when the right day would come." He smiled. But I knew there would be one. Tears blurred my vision. "Grandpa, I couldn't afford diamonds. You never had to. I just wanted you to have something from me." I fastened the necklace around my neck. It instantly became more valuable than anything else I wore that day. Because love gives ordinary things extraordinary meaning. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Ethan stood at the altar with the same nervous smile I'd fallen in love with years earlier. When the music began, every guest rose to their feet. I looked toward the front row. My mother was there. My father was beside her. Relief washed over me. For one hopeful moment, I believed they'd changed their minds. Maybe love had won after all. Maybe yesterday had simply been a terrible misunderstanding. I was wrong, very wrong. The ceremony ended with applause, laughter, and tears. Friends embraced. Families posed for photographs. Children chased each other across the lawn. It was everything a wedding should be. Until we entered the ballroom. Immediately, I noticed something. The seating chart had been changed. Again. Without telling me. I walked directly to the head table. There were 6 place cards. Mine, Ethan's, his parents, my mother, my father. Grandpa's name was gone. I searched every table. Finally, I found it, table 17. Exactly where my father had planned all along, hidden behind a massive floral display near the back of the room. Almost completely out of sight. My hands began to shake. Ethan quietly took the seating chart from me. "They changed it." I nodded. "They waited until after the ceremony. So I couldn't stop them." Before either of us could react, I spotted Grandpa. He was already walking toward table 17. Not because he wanted to. Because he didn't want to ruin my wedding day. That was who he had always been. The kind of man who accepted pain if it meant protecting someone else. I hurried after him. "Grandpa." He turned with that same peaceful smile. "It's all right." "No, it isn't." He glanced around the crowded ballroom. "Hannah, everyone's watching." "I know. And that's exactly why I don't want you making this harder. You belong with us. I belong wherever your heart is." Then he gently squeezed my shoulder. "I've spent my whole life in the background. It never bothered me. What matters today is that you're happy." I wanted to argue. Instead, I hugged him. Long enough that several nearby guests quietly wiped away tears. As I returned toward the head table, something unexpected happened. The ballroom entrance suddenly grew unusually quiet. Heads began turning. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A line of black luxury SUVs had just pulled up outside. Several sharply dressed men entered first, followed by assistants carrying garment bags and briefcases. Whispers spread quickly through the room. "As that can't be." I thought he wasn't coming. Even my father stood up so quickly that his chair nearly tipped over. His face transformed instantly. The tension disappeared. Now he looked excited, almost nervous. He hurried across the ballroom with a smile I'd never seen before. Standing in the doorway was the man every executive at Meridian Freight Systems recognized immediately. The company's CEO, the very person my father had spent 25 years trying to impress. Dad straightened his tie before extending his hand. "Mr. Harrison, what an incredible honor. I wasn't expecting you." The CEO shook his hand politely. "I was in the area. I thought I'd stop by to congratulate the bride." My father's smile widened. He immediately began introducing board members, department heads, and senior executives. The CEO nodded courteously. But he wasn't really listening. His eyes had already drifted past them. He was staring at someone across the ballroom, someone sitting quietly at table 17. For several long seconds, he didn't move. Then, without another word, he walked away from my father. Straight across the ballroom, every conversation stopped. Every eye followed him. He walked past the head table, past the executives, past the honored guests, until he stopped directly in front of Grandpa Walter. The old man slowly looked up, clearly confused. The CEO's face softened into a smile, one filled with genuine respect. Then, in a voice loud enough for half the ballroom to hear, he said 4 words that changed everything. "Walter, is that really you?" The ballroom fell completely silent. Not the polite kind of silence that follows a speech. This was the kind that settles over a room when everyone realizes they've just witnessed something they don't understand. Grandpa slowly pushed his chair back. He looked at the distinguished man standing before him, studying his face for a long moment. Then a smile spread across his own. One of recognition, one of genuine affection. "Richard." The CEO laughed. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't recognize me." A grandpa chuckled softly. "It's been, 25 years?" 28, Richard answered. "But who's counting?" Before anyone could process what was happening, Richard stepped forward and wrapped Grandpa in a warm embrace. Not a quick handshake, not a polite greeting. A heartfelt hug between 2 men who clearly shared a history. Every executive in the room froze, including my father. I'd never seen that expression on his face before. Complete confusion. He looked from Richard to Grandpa and back again, as though trying to solve a puzzle that made no sense. Richard stepped back, smiling. "I've looked for you for years." Grandpa shrugged modestly. "I wasn't very hard to find." "I know," Richard said with a laugh. "You just never wanted any attention." That sounded exactly like Grandpa. Richard glanced around the ballroom before looking back at Grandpa. "I can't believe they seated you back here." Grandpa answered with his usual grace. "It's perfectly fine." "No," Richard replied firmly. "It isn't." His voice wasn't angry, it was disappointed. The kind of disappointment that carries far more weight. He turned toward the room. "Does everyone here know who this man is?" No one answered. My father finally stepped forward. "Mr. Harrison." I was just about to introduce. Richard gently raised a hand. "Please." "I'd like to do the introducing." The room became even quieter. Richard rested one hand on Grandpa's shoulder. "This man changed my life." People exchanged puzzled glances. I was 16 years old when my father died. My mother worked 2 jobs. There were days I honestly didn't know whether I'd finish high school. He smiled at Grandpa. But every morning before classes started, Mr. Walter Brooks was already there. Sweeping floors. Unlocking classrooms. Making sure the building was ready for hundreds of kids. Then Richard looked around the room. What most people didn't know was what happened after everyone else went home. He paused for a moment, almost as though he wanted everyone to absorb every word. I couldn't afford new textbooks. Brooks found used copies. My basketball shoes had holes in them. He somehow showed up one Monday morning with a brand new pair. I never knew where they came from. Grandpa looked down at the floor. Richard smiled knowingly. "I do now. You worked extra weekend shifts to buy them." A grandpa quietly shook his head. "It wasn't a big deal." Richard laughed softly. "It was to me," he continued. "One college acceptance letters arrived. I got into Ohio State, but I couldn't pay tuition." The room listened without moving. I was ready to give up. Then one afternoon, Mr. Brooks handed me an envelope. I thought it was another recommendation letter. It wasn't. It was a cashier's check. I saw Grandpa close his eyes, almost embarrassed. Richard's voice grew quieter. "He told me someone believed in me." I asked who. He smiled and said, "Someone who expects you to help someone else someday." Richard looked directly at Grandpa. "It wasn't anonymous. It was you." A collective gasp swept across the ballroom. I turned toward Grandpa. He'd never mentioned any of this. Not once. Not during all the years we'd spent together. Not when we struggled. Not when he worked overtime. Not even after retirement. Richard continued. "I tried paying him back after I graduated. He refused. I tried again after my first promotion. He refused again. Then he disappeared." A grandpa finally spoke. "I retired. And I figured you'd built the life you deserved. Richard smiled. I did. Because someone believed in me before I believed in myself. Richard slowly turned toward the executives gathered near the head table. I've spent decades speaking about leadership, about integrity, about character. Then he pointed gently toward Grandpa. This is the person who taught me what those words actually mean. No one moved. Several executives lowered their eyes. Others looked toward Grandpa with an entirely different expression than before. Not curiosity. Respect. Deep respect. Richard wasn't finished. When I became CEO, I created our Employee Scholarship Foundation. Every single year, we send deserving students to college. He smiled. Most people think it was my idea. It wasn't. I simply copied the example of the man sitting in front of you. My father looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For 25 years, he'd worked tirelessly to earn Richard Harrison's respect. And all along, the man Richard admired most had been sitting quietly at family dinners, ignored, excluded, embarrassed by his own son. Richard finally looked at my father. There wasn't anger in his expression, only sadness. I've known Daniel Brooks for many years. I always wondered why he never introduced me to his father. The question hung in the air. My father's face turned pale. No one came to his defense. No one could. Because there wasn't a single explanation that didn't sound hollow. Richard glanced back at Grandpa, then toward me. His eyes softened. Hannah, you must be incredibly proud. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I've always been. Richard smiled. You should be. Then he looked around the ballroom one last time. I've met presidents, Fortune 500 executives, and leaders from around the world, but very few people have left a legacy as meaningful as Walter Brooks. The applause started quietly. One table, then another. Within seconds, every guest in the ballroom was on their feet. The standing ovation seemed endless. Grandpa looked overwhelmed, almost uncomfortable. He kept shaking his head as if to say he didn't deserve it. But for the first time in decades, the entire room saw him exactly the way I always had. Not because of the job he'd held, but because of the lives he'd changed. For what felt like forever, the applause refused to die down. Grandpa stood there looking completely overwhelmed, his weathered hands resting lightly on the back of his chair. Recognition had never been something he chased. In fact, if he could have slipped quietly out of the ballroom, I think he would have. That was simply who he was. Richard Harrison smiled and gently placed a hand on Grandpa's shoulder. You've spent your whole life standing behind everyone else, he said. Today, it's our turn to stand behind you. Another wave of applause swept through the room. I glanced toward my father. His shoulders had slumped. The confidence he'd carried all weekend was gone. For the first time in my life, he looked small. Not because anyone had humiliated him, because he had been forced to face himself. Richard turned toward the banquet manager. I think we've got a seating problem. The manager looked nervous. Yes, sir. I believe Mr. Brooks has been placed at the wrong table. The manager glanced awkwardly at my father before answering. I was following the seating chart we were given. Richard nodded politely. I'm sure you were. Then he smiled. Let's fix it. Within moments, staff members quietly began moving place settings. The room watched in silence. The seat beside mine at the head table was prepared once again, exactly where it should have been all along. Richard walked over to Grandpa. Would you do me the honor? Grandpa hesitated. Oh, I don't want to inconvenience anyone. Richard laughed softly. Walter, you've spent your life making things easier for everyone else. Please let us do this for you. Grandpa looked at me. I simply nodded. With moist eyes, he slowly walked toward the head table. As he passed each table, guests smiled warmly. Some reached out to shake his hand. Others quietly thanked him. Several parents introduced him to their children. Without realizing it, everyone in that ballroom had begun measuring success differently. Dinner resumed, but the atmosphere had completely changed. Earlier, conversations had revolved around stock markets, promotions, luxury vacations, and business deals. Now people shared stories about teachers who had changed their lives, neighbors who had quietly helped others, mentors they'd never properly thanked. Grandpa listened to each story as though it were the most important one he'd ever heard. He remembered names, faces, tiny details from decades ago. One woman approached our table with tears in her eyes. "You probably don't remember me." Grandpa smiled. "Were you in Mrs. Smiled, Campbell's third-grade class?" The woman gasped. "You do remember. You broke your wrist falling off the monkey bars. You were more worried about missing the school play than the cast." She covered her mouth. "That was 40 years ago." Grandpa shrugged with a smile. "Some people are easy to remember." Watching that exchange, I realized something. He hadn't just cleaned classrooms. He had quietly collected thousands of lives. As dessert was served, my father slowly stood. No microphone, no prepared speech, just a man carrying more regret than pride. Every conversation stopped. He walked toward Grandpa. Each step seemed heavier than the last. When he finally reached our table, he didn't look at anyone else. Only Grandpa. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. Then his voice broke. "Dad." It was the first time I'd heard him call Grandpa that in years. "I owe you an apology." Grandpa immediately shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." "No. I owe you more than I can ever repay." My father's eyes filled with tears. "I spent my whole life trying to impress people who already respected you. I was so busy chasing titles that I forgot who taught me what real work looked like." The ballroom remained silent. No one wanted to interrupt. "I was embarrassed by your job." He paused. When I should have been proud of the man. A tear rolled down his face. "I'm sorry. I am so sorry." The grandpa looked at his son for a long moment. Then he stood. Instead of criticizing him, instead of reminding him of every painful memory, he simply wrapped his arms around him. The room watched as father and son embraced. Grandpa gently patted his back. "You don't have to spend the rest of your life paying for yesterday." He smiled. "You just have to live tomorrow differently." Those words settled over the ballroom like a quiet prayer. There was no bitterness, no scorekeeping, no desire to make anyone feel guilty, only forgiveness. Complete and unconditional. I understood then that forgiveness isn't pretending the hurt never happened. It's refusing to let the hurt have the final word. Later that evening, Ethan and I shared our first dance as husband and wife. As the music played, I looked around the ballroom. Grandpa was laughing with Richard Harrison. My parents were talking with Ethan's family. Not about careers, not about status, just talking. For the first time, everyone seemed equal. Not because their titles had disappeared, because they no longer mattered. When the song ended, Ethan whispered in my ear, "You know, I think your grandfather was the most important person here today." I smiled. I've known that my whole life. Before Richard left, he walked over to Grandpa one last time. "I've got a favor to ask." Grandpa chuckled. "What kind of favor?" Richard reached into his pocket and handed him a business card. "Our scholarship foundation holds a leadership retreat every spring." He smiled. "I'd like you to speak." Grandpa nearly laughed. "Richard, I've never given a speech in my life." "Exactly. People have heard enough from executives. I'd rather they hear from someone who actually changed lives." Grandpa looked down at the card, then back at Richard. "I'll think about it." Richard grinned. "I know you will." As he walked away, he called over his shoulder, "And Walter, don't make me wait another 28 years. The room erupted in laughter, even Grandpa. For the first time all day, it was a laugh completely free of sadness. That night, as the reception came to an end, I caught one last glimpse of Grandpa. He wasn't standing in the spotlight. He was helping the staff stack chairs, straightening tablecloths, picking up napkins, doing what he'd always done. Leaving every room better than he found it. People often ask me what happened after that wedding. They expect me to tell them that everything changed overnight, that my father suddenly became a different man, that our family instantly became perfect. Life doesn't work that way. Real change is usually much quieter. It happens one choice at a time, one conversation at a time, one act of humility at a time. My father couldn't erase 30 years of mistakes in a single afternoon. But for the first time, he stopped pretending those mistakes didn't exist. A few weeks after the wedding, he drove to Grandpa's house alone. No business suit, no expensive watch, no phone pressed against his ear, just a son carrying 2 cups of coffee. Grandpa answered the door wearing his old flannel shirt, surprised to see him. "What brings you here?" Dad held up the coffee. "I was hoping we could talk." Grandpa smiled. "I've got a porch with 2 empty chairs." That afternoon stretched into evening. Neither of them ever told me everything they discussed, and I never asked. Some conversations belong only to the people having them. But I noticed something afterward. Dad started visiting every Saturday. Sometimes they'd fish. Sometimes they'd work in the garden. Sometimes they'd sit for hours saying almost nothing. For 2 men who had spent years growing apart, silence became the first step toward healing. A month later, something happened that made me smile. Dad called me with an unusual request. "Hannah, do you still have Grandpa's cinnamon roll recipe?" I laughed. "You? Baking?" "I'm trying." The first batch looked like hockey pucks. I couldn't stop laughing. That's exactly what happened to Grandpa the first time he made them. There was a pause. Then Dad laughed too. It was the first genuine laugh I'd heard from him in years. Not the polished laugh he used at company dinners. Not the careful laugh meant to impress clients. Just my dad. Richard Harrison kept his promise. That spring, Grandpa spoke at the company's leadership retreat. He almost backed out 3 times. "I don't belong on a stage," he told me the night before. "You've spent your whole life in front of people," I reminded him. "You just didn't notice." The auditorium held nearly 500 managers and executives. Most expected a polished corporate presentation. Instead, an 80-year-old retired custodian walked onto the stage carrying a folded piece of notebook paper. He looked around the room, adjusted his glasses, and smiled. "I've never given a speech before, so if I make mistakes, I hope you'll forgive an old janitor." The audience laughed warmly. By the time he finished 40 minutes later, many of those same executives were wiping away tears. He never mentioned profits. He never talked about leadership theories. He simply shared stories about lonely children, overworked teachers, small acts of kindness, and one sentence that had guided his entire life. "Leave every room better than you found it." That speech became the highest-rated leadership session the company had ever hosted. Richard later told me employees requested copies for years afterward. Grandpa never became famous. He never wanted to. If you asked him about that standing ovation, he'd shrug and change the subject. If someone called him inspiring, he'd point toward someone else. Recognition still made him uncomfortable. Kindness didn't. He kept volunteering at the elementary school. He still fixed broken bicycles for neighborhood kids. He still shoveled snow from elderly neighbors' driveways before they woke up, and every Christmas, without fail, anonymous grocery gift cards somehow appeared in the mailboxes of families who were struggling. No one could ever prove where they came from. But I think we all knew. 5 years later, Ethan and I welcomed our first daughter. The moment Grandpa held her, his eyes filled with tears. "So this is my next little partner," he whispered. When she was old enough to talk, she'd follow him everywhere. She'd carry his tiny toolbox while he fixed things around the house. She'd hand him nails that were too big, screws that were too short. The wrong wrench almost every time. He'd smile anyway. One afternoon, I overheard her ask, "Great, Grandpa. Why do you always help people?" He looked down at her with the same patient smile I'd known my whole life. "Because one day, someone will need you, and I want you to know how." When Grandpa passed away at 91, the church wasn't big enough. People stood along the walls, filled the hallways, some even listened from outside. Former students traveled from different states, teachers, firefighters, nurses, business owners, military veterans, judges, parents, children. People from every walk of life. Many had never met each other. Yet every one of them shared a similar story. He helped me. He believed in me. He showed up when nobody else did. Richard Harrison spoke briefly. He looked toward Grandpa's casket before saying, "Companies measure success in quarterly reports. Walter Brooks measured success in human lives. And by that measure, he may have been the richest man I've ever known." There wasn't a dry eye in the church. After the service, I drove to Grandpa's house one last time. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. His reading glasses rested beside his favorite chair. The coffee mug sat neatly by the sink. His old toolbox remained on the workbench. Inside, I found a small envelope with my name written across the front. My hands trembled as I opened it. There was only one handwritten note. Kiddo, if you're reading this, don't waste time wishing you'd said one more thing to me. You already did. You said it every time you chose kindness. Remember, leave every room better than you found it. Love. Grandpa. I folded the note against my heart and cried. Not because he'd left us, but because I realized something beautiful. People like Grandpa never really leave. They continue living in every life they touched. In every act of kindness they inspired. In every person who chooses character over status, compassion over pride, love over appearance. My father still keeps that note framed in his office, not next to his awards, not beside his executive certificates, but directly across from his desk, where he sees it every single morning, because he finally learned what Grandpa had known all along. A job may tell people how you make a living, but your character tells them whether your life truly mattered. And if there's one lesson I hope my children, and someday my grandchildren, carry forward, it's the same one that shaped my entire life: leave every room and every heart better than you found it.